36A. 36. Two.
Saying that we can.
Two, six, eight.
What actually happens to people? But I'll figure it out. I do that every single time.
Hi there. How are you, Kelly? I'm still letting people in, so give me a minute.
Yeah, great. Thank you. I was muted.
Big. Well, it looks like we have a small but select group today. Let me fix my camera here. How's everybody's day going?
Good.
Good? It's kind of a quiet week with it seems like the holiday kind of carried over. People were taking a few days off this week too. Or maybe just vacation season has started, I don't
Oh, that's true. Yeah.
know. Is it Tejan? How do you say your first name?
Tejan.
Tejan.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I think you told me that before.
No worries.
Do you guys have any questions that occurred to you after the last class?
No, not really.
Nothing off the top of your head?
Yeah.
Okay, that's good. Today we're going to talk about the second half of the purchase and sale. So last week we covered the first half. And I have an extra Wednesday this month because we give the classes the first 4 Wednesdays of the month. And this week there are 5. So do you guys have any particular topic you would like to have covered? Sometimes I do an extra class on a special topic.
I don't
Okay,
feel
well,
like
I
knowing
will
now.
think about that.
Yeah.
Sometimes there are some events that occur, issues that come up in the market center. And if it seems like it would be valuable for the brokers to have some additional information, I will, use that as a jumping off point, a starting point to.
I have a
discuss.
question about that actually. Susan, I was at the class last night for like first time home buyers because I
Oh,
wanted to see the
great.
presentation.
Yeah, with Debbie.
Yeah, which was really great. And she made reference to a newer form that has to be used if you're, I think of it, if you're representing the buyer. Are
Um,
we going to cover that form as part of this course
Well,
too?
the buyer brokerage service agreement is the agency agreement with the buyer. And there is an amendment form for that. It's 41A. Think of A for amendment. But there is a new referral form coming out on the 25th.
Oh,
And
maybe that's the one.
it's 11A. And I did talk about that at the team meeting this week and last week, and I posted on the Facebook page. So you could are you on our Facebook page?
Yes.
Okay, so you could check out my post on that. And I may just do a video on that and post that on the Facebook page as well, because um, it's always an adjustment getting used to a new form. So thanks for mentioning that. I'm gonna write that down. Fifth Wednesday. Actually, yeah, go ahead.
I had done the classes, the Northwest MLS classes, the matrix and the listing essential
Oh,
stuff.
good. Yeah.
And in that they mentioned all of these different fines if you don't do something right. So
Yeah.
I'm paranoid about any forms and
Well,
I know
Form,
what we're
Form
supposed to do.
11 is a new form that is the foundation of the reason that they created this form is that there's an industry trend that's been going on since the Dodd-Frank Act after the 2008 mortgage debacle for increased transparency and disclosure to consumers in the lending um, arena and also, escrow and real estate. So that has changed. And now that legislation has followed that same trend. And so a recent law was passed that requires additional disclosure to buyers and sellers around referral fees. So that's the reason for the form, but it's pretty easy to fill out. But what I'm kind of working on for next week's meeting is to develop some scenarios when you'd be using the form and then talk about how you'd use the form in specific scenarios. So I think that might be helpful, Obviously, we haven't started using it yet because it's not out yet, but the sample forms are available. If you go on the MLS and put in Legal Bulletin 229, it
Okay.
has sample forms in there. I did hand out hard copies as well at the meeting yesterday. And anyway, you can review the sample forms there, and then also you both should know that almost all the forms in the MLS are available they are all available in express forms. But along with the forms, over to the right, it says man, and then the number of the form, like man 21, and man starts is short for manual. And it's a step-by-step instruction on how to fill out the forms. And a lot of people, never look at the manual, and that's a good one, a good resource to have if you're kind of like, wait a minute, what do I put in this blank? You can read that manual, and it gives you some tips on how to fill it out. And of course, you can always call, if you have a mentor, if you are working with Thaisa as coach, or you can ask another someone who's on if you're working with a team, and then you can always call me because I'm the compliance queen. That's compliance and legalities and rules and laws. That's my arena of expertise and responsibility. So you can always ask me too. And I do think I get more questions from experienced brokers on how to fill out forms, than new brokers, because you guys are learning it all right to start with. Brokers who've been in the business for a while, sometimes they keep filling out forms the way they used to be, and then they get into trouble. So you're lucky because you're learning it right the first time around. So that's very good. I'm going to share my screen so you can look at the Form 21 with me. Okay, so last week we covered items 1 through 8, and now we're going to do 9 through 18 today. And a couple housekeeping things. We do take a break about halfway through the class. Feel free to ask questions as we go along. You don't have to wait for a break, or you can send me a chat message if that's easier for you. And I do give the class in the same order each month: purchase and sale part 1, part 2, and then commonly used addenda, which is probably my favorite class. And we go through the financing addenda really, really carefully because they're fairly complex, and then include some addenda that should be used in every residential transaction. And then the 4th class is inspection forms and process. So remember that in writing the contract, remember you are in essence practicing law, even though we're just filling in the blanks. So we are licensed and insured to use only the forms that are approved by attorneys, and those, of course, are the ones that are in our MLS system. So remember that if we fill in our forms incorrectly, and or omit information, we could render our contract void, voidable, unenforceable, or we could create a situation where we don't get paid. That's a line 17 is a critical line to understand and be able to complete so that you can get paid. So we'll try and talk about the significance of each item and refer to the corresponding paragraphs in the subsequent pages of the purchase and sale. Once you've completed all 4 classes, you do get 8 clock hours, and you'll get a certificate that you can keep in your records and use those 8 hours toward your elective hours for your license renewal, which is every 2 years. And your first renewal is 90 hours after, and there are some requirements. If either of you want to know what those requirements are, need details on that, I have a kind of a 1-page reminder that I send out, and you are responsible for tracking all your hours. So I would encourage you to keep a side screen. Mine's labeled Real Estate Continuing Education. And every time I get a certificate, I throw it into my side screen. I also, because I'm kind of old fashioned, I do keep, I'm looking around for my notebook. I keep a notebook as well with hard copies, and then I have like a cover page where I write down every class and how many hours it is per renewal cycle, so that I can easily look at that renewal cycle and figure out how many hours I've taken and what else I need. It's whatever system you choose, just have a system, because we have no way of tracking your hours. You might take it from a title company, Seattle King County Association of Realtors, Washington Association of Realtors, your Ignite hours, Forms Mastery, we can track that, but you need to track your own accumulation of clock hours for your renewal. I'm going over this in such detail because I just renewed my license yesterday and it was kind of weighing on my mind, and I still am like 6 weeks out from my actual renewal date, but it's good to start early because I can't remember if it's every 6 years or maybe it's 7. You have to get fingerprinted, and that can add a couple weeks to the process. They won't renew your license if you have fingerprinting due. So a lot of people are taken unawares by that. Then they have to schedule an appointment to get fingerprinted. Then the fingerprints get processed. I think they run them probably through the state patrol or something. And then those results go to the MLS, and then you can process your renewal. So, and of course, it's faster to renew online. If you mail in your renewal, that can take a couple extra weeks too for them to process. So when you get to that point, I mean, just chip away at your hours. Rockwell is a good resource. CE Shop, there are other companies that offer online classes that give clock hours. So don't wait until the last month to try to get your 90 hours in. And there are renewal packages available from those education providers that I just mentioned. And so you can take a class here and there, and then you can also, or you can take a whole renewal package, or you can take a class here or there and then hop onto one of the sites like Rockwell, which I happen to like, to get the required classes completed as well as your elective hours. Okay, we're going to start with line 9, title insurance company. This is where you're going to fill in the name of the title insurance that will issue the policy of title insurance for the subject property. Most of the time, the buyer isn't going to know or care really who it is. They'll look to you for guidance. So remember that there is a 2010 license law change that makes it illegal to accept or ask for favors or enticements from a title company. What you're looking for is somebody who has shown great service to clients, or has a good program that might benefit your client. That's fine to suggest that company to your client. We also have an affiliate title company, and that's Title Alliance. Their office happens to be right here in the Federal Way building. And Tanisha Hunter is the closer, the escrow closer, and she's great to work with. And I love being able to just walk over there and ask her a question or have her pull up, a file for me if we have some kind of an issue or problem or question about it. Anyway, she's very easy to work with, and that's a starting point for you if you don't know any don't have any experience with any particular title company or closing agent. Sometimes the listing agent has already opened title with a title company, and they might specify in the listing, please use Chicago Title, please use First American Title, and they might even have a closer that they would like to work with. Please use Title with First American Chris Nordyke, Title with CW Title, Sonia Leal, something like that. It's best, unless your buyer has a really strong preference, it's better to start out in a non-adversarial situation with a listing agent, and to avoid a squabble over something that normally only matters to the brokers, as long as the company they're suggesting is priced competitively and gives good service, you can use them. So that sets the table early for negotiations with a friendly interaction rather than an adversarial one, as long as your client understands and agrees with that strategy. And what is title insurance? Well, title insurance is a little different from other kinds of insurance in that it insures against what happened in the past. Most other insurance that we have in our lives insures against something that's going to happen or may happen in the future. Flood insurance, homeowners insurance, car insurance. You might have an accident. Somebody might hit you. Life insurance. They have health insurance, pet insurance. They have pet health insurance now. What other kinds of insurance can you think of? Did I cover it all? So that kind of insurance insures against some event, earthquake insurance that it might happen in the future. I heard on the news this morning that there were some, I guess, little earthquakes around under Mount Rainier, but they're not expecting an eruption anytime soon, so they're not too worried about it. But title insurance insures against what has happened in the past. They research a chain of title. That means the ownership throughout the life of the property since it was built. And they insure against things like fraud, scrivener's errors. I think we now would call it clerical errors. Sometimes documents don't get cleared from title because there's a typo, a missing digit, a reversed series of numbers, or just the last number is a 3 instead of an 8 or something like that. Anyway, fraud, that's another word they insure against. So what they're saying is that only the buyer has the right to the ownership of the property, and they're insuring against that. Now, there are some things that run with title, that run with the land, that stay on title, and there are some things, liens, and those are financial encumbrances that must be cleared before you can close. So title and escrow work hand in glove to clear those items. A common lien on title would be a mortgage. That's a financial encumbrance that is specific to that property. And that's typically paid at closing, paid off from the seller's proceeds. So let's look at paragraphs D and E that expand on this concept of condition of title and title insurance. So the seller has a contractual responsibility to provide a marketable title at closing. I'm in paragraph D now. Here are some of the things that would cause a title to be unmarketable. Oh, that would not cause the title to be unmarketable. So that would be like CC&Rs, covenants, conditions, and restrictions. Typically, you see those with homeowners associations, condo associations, easements, encroachments that don't materially affect the value or unduly interfere with the buyer's reasonable use of the property, and oil and mining rights. A seller can't convey or reserve any of those oil or mineral rights after mutual unless the buyer provides their written consent. Again, monetary encumbrances or liens that are not being assumed by the buyer, and most buyers don't want to assume monetary responsibility of the seller, have to be paid or discharged by the seller on or before closing. So other things might be an HOA lien, a DSHS lien, a federal tax lien, a judgment. Maybe they have a second mortgage as well as a first. All those things have to be paid off at or before closing. Oh no. Uh-oh, are you guys there? My screen just went black. Okay,
I'm here.
that was weird. I don't know what happened. It's not like it's stormy out. Okay. If the agreement for the conveyance is of a buyer's interest in a real estate contract, the warranty deed, that's the conveyance document that transfers ownership from the seller to the buyer, includes the buyer's assignment of the contract sufficient to convey after title, acquired title. So let's talk a little bit about when you look at a title report. Because those exceptions like CC&Rs and existing liens, they're going to show up on the title report. And when I was a new agent, I did not understand the language at all. It was just like a whole nother language. So I would call up my title officer and say, are there any red flags on this? Anything I should be concerned about? Can you go over it with me and help me understand? And they do this all day long. And your escrow closer can also help you this way. And some companies actually issue a red flag report that will tell you, what things are problematic, what things need to be cleared, and if there are things that are going to prevent the title from being marketable. We recently had one deal fall apart where it was an estate and uh, the seller, who was the executor of the estate, had had an attorney for the estate because it was going through probate. That's the court process where the will is executed. And the attorney said, sure, you can go ahead and list it and sell it. Okay, great. Well, so after after the title was issued, after mutual acceptance, it was discovered that there was a transfer on death deed. So that means that's created prior to somebody passing away, that they execute this transfer on death deed that says, when I die, the title is going to go to this person. So only one person knew about it. One of the, I think there were 5 heirs, and the executor was one of them. So only the one who had been designated as the new owner knew about this. None of the other heirs knew about it. And there's a period of time for that to be in effect. And it was for 6 months later than our closing date was, right? So the heirs could not agree on what to do about this transfer on death deed, because in the will, they all had a right to some portion of the estate. So it turned into a big family feud. And because the heirs wouldn't agree on how to deal with this transfer on death deed, and the person who was the designated new owner, they didn't want to give up the ownership of the property, even though the will said something different. So it turned into a big legal mess. And the end result was that we didn't have marketable title. The seller did not have marketable title because it was clouded by this transfer on death deed, and the heirs couldn't, it could have been resolved if the heirs had agreed on on what to do, who's going to get how much. In other words, they couldn't agree on the division of the property of the estate, including the house. So we had a sale fail. And subsequently, I get a call. I'm in Walmart waiting for them to bring the order to my car on a Saturday morning. And and I get a call from the buyer who explained to me that they, had an offer on a property, and then the sale was canceled, and they wanted to be compensated for their inspection and their appraisal, because they felt that it seemed to them that the property should never have been listed since it had this cloud on title. And so they wanted to be compensated. So what's the fallacy of this reasoning? We talked about earnest money last time. So remember that earnest money serves 2 purposes. One is it is a statement to the seller saying, hey, I'm really serious about buying your property and here's some money. I'm going to put part of my purchase price in escrow right now, can be held throughout closing. And if I default or we fail to close, that's the amount of liquidated damages. So, and that's capped at 5% of the purchase price. So if you put in more than the purchase price down, more than 5% of the purchase price down, and you default as a buyer, the seller would get up to 5% of the sales price, and you would get the balance refunded to you, right? So because it was specified on the contract that forfeiture was, that the earnest money was the whole amount of liquidated damages, and the seller had defaulted and the buyer had received their earnest money back, there really wasn't any more contractual obligation for the seller to give them any more money. They were unable to provide marketable title, so the buyer got their earnest money back. So that's where it was left. I actually had our attorney write a letter stipulating to that and sent it to the buyer, and I haven't heard any more subsequently. I think possibly they got their own attorney and got the advice that, hey, you guys, they terminated over failure to close. So the buyer had initiated the termination and had received their earnest money back. So there really was no more legal ground to go after the seller, but they tried.
I have a question.
Yeah,
So like the earnest money was basically the buyer's money before that they put in, right?
yeah,
And then so then they also paid for inspection, correct? Would they
the buyer paid for inspection and appraisal, yes.
would that be from the escrow money or like them out of pocket?
That's out of pocket.
Okay. So basically even if they get their escrow money back, they still the money that they paid for the inspection, they still lost, correct?
Yes, and that's something your buyers should know up front. You know, if you at any point, if you know, there are situations where the contract could be terminated and you would get your earnest money back,
Uh,
but your appraisal and your inspection, you have to pay those out of pocket. Now, back in the day, I mean, when I was married, we moved around a lot because of my husband's job. And I remember that lenders used to be able to roll an appraisal into the purchase price. We could roll all kinds of stuff into one time we rolled window coverings into the purchase price, which, you know, is kind of nice. I mean, that then you amortize that amount. I mean, true, you're paying interest on it, but on the other hand, you'd have to come up with a few $1,000s cash out of pocket, right? But I remember the appraisal used to be rolled into the purchase price instead of you having to pay for it, you know, outside of the transaction. So that, you know, earnest money is the amount at risk. And if you pay for other costs and fees uh, outside of escrow, in other words, it's not something that you're going to pay for, you know, at closing. Um, that's just money out of pocket, and it is expensive. But if buyers ever said to me, well, you know, gee, the house looks good to me and it's fairly new and I don't want to pay 500 for an appraisal, you know, or sorry, appraisal is going to be required by a lender. I don't want to pay for an inspection, you know. And my response to that was, hey, you're paying $500,000 for a house. Isn't it worth 500 to know what you're getting into? There are a lot of things that we can't see and we can't evaluate, whether it's in the crawl space, in the attic, on the roof, the electrical panel, the life of the hot water heater, the efficacy of the furnace, how old the furnace is. Even if it's not material defects that need to be fixed before closing, even if it's not something we're going to ask the seller to fix, it's helpful as a homeowner to know, you know, how much life is left on the furnace so that you can budget for that. I mean, those are fairly big ticket. And the roof, what about the age of the roof? Maybe it's fine now, but you know, if it's 15 years old, you might be looking at having to do some big repairs or replacements in 5 years or so. So it's helpful for you as a homeowner to be able to budget for those big ticket items. That usually did the trick.
Susan, I have a follow-up question.
Sure.
So is there any kind of a preliminary title that a person could maybe run after there's an offer, but before the buyer has made these
Yes, good
expense?
question. There is preliminary title. And
Okay,
I would encourage you as a when you're doing a listing, to open title at the, you know, you can open title before you even go to the listing appointment. And then you can get that preliminary set of information, the trio or a pre-listing packet where you've got, basically it's information that's of public record, but it saves you having to go and pull that, you know, um, a property profile, a map, a legal description. You can ask them to pull property tax for you if you want. The property taxes are available on the county websites, the county assessor portion of the county website. And that's just basic due diligence for you to do that before you take a listing. So you can take a look at title and uh, see if there are any if there's anything that is of concern, that you could ask your clients about it. You know, they might, I've had clients not tell me they had a second mortgage on a property. So that when, you know, if you're trying to estimate what their proceeds are gonna be, it looks a lot different if they've got a second lien on the property, you know? So for that reason, I tended not to do a seller's net proceeds sheet. I would just kind of do a rough estimation. You know, closing costs are gonna be about 9–10%. And if I told them 10% and their closing costs came in below that, they were real happy. But if you tell them it's gonna be 8% and it comes in at 9, they're gonna be real unhappy. There is a tool that you can use on the MLS under financial tools to run a seller's proceeds sheet. But if you have a seller who's real anxious to find out how much they're gonna clear in a certain deal, get escrow to run an estimated settlement statement for you. And that's gonna require some cooperation from the seller because they will need the current loan servicer, the loan number, and the seller's written authorization for escrow, who's a third party, not the, you know, mortgagee, to obtain a payoff on the seller's behalf. And then some of the other, you know, they can prorate out the taxes and HOA fees and all that stuff. And they can do that really early in a transaction. They typically don't do it until they're a month or less out from closing because those payouts are only good for a certain amount of time. But I would say I wouldn't do a seller's net. I would get escrow to do it personally. Everybody has a little different philosophy on this. I worked with one broker. She was my managing broker that I worked with a lot the first year I was a broker, and she would basically do it on a napkin, real cash. And she said, "Oh no, I never give them a net proceeds, you know, because there are too many variables in that equation." So that's kind of been my underlying philosophy ever since. You know, you don't want them to hold you to something when you've prepared an estimation and you don't have all the right information to do it. Anyway. Okay, so I think we've covered title insurance pretty much, right? So let's talk about who's the closing agent. Well, that's escrow. What's escrow? Well, they're a neutral third party. They work, a lot of times you're going to use the same title and escrow company. I'm the same company for title and escrow. That's a very convenient and smooth way to manage your transaction. Escrow is going to communicate with the clients. They can facilitate your earnest money deposit. They are going to communicate with buyer and seller about needed documents and information that the clients need to provide to them, like the information on the existing loan, who the utility companies are, contact information for the HOA. Sometimes they need a identity affidavit to clear. If your client's name is John Robert Smith, there are probably going to be a few things, a few judgments or different things that might pop up because their name is not unusual. And that's true for a lot of different ethnic groups. You know, if your last name is Wen, Nguyen, or your last name is Chen or Garcia, you know, or Smith or Jones, they might need more information to clear some of those things to make sure you've got the right person for that particular financial encumbrance. So they do work on title clearing with the clients by getting more information that way. And then they collect and earnest money funds, loan funds are wired into them, as well as the buyer's down payment is deposited there. So they prepare, legal documents pursuant to the real estate transaction. So that's gonna include not just settlement statements and escrow closing documents, but they work closely with the lender to balance the file and make sure all of the fees and charges are correct, and they blend title and escrow information and fees along with the lender fees and to create the estimated settlement statement. They also can prepare things like deeds. So whether it's a statutory warranty deed, they can do deeds of trust, deeds of sale, any kind of deed. Quick claim deed, maybe you've got an ex-spouse that needs to sign off on the sale, and they can either sign all the closing documents or do a quick claim deed. And again, they prepare the deed that's going to transfer the ownership from the seller to the buyer and get it recorded at closing. They also will record any other deeds that are affiliated with the closing, like the deed of trust, because that's collateralized. That means it's tied to the property. The loan is tied to the property. So there are two really critical loan documents. Well, there are a lot, but I mean, a loan package can be over 100 pages. But one is the note, and that's like a check that the buyer writes to the lender, says, I'm borrowing this much money. I'm going to pay it back to you in these increments at these intervals for this much time until it's paid off. And then the deed of trust is recorded, and that says the note is collateralized. That means it's tied to the property. So what does that mean to the buyer? Well, it means if you don't make your payment, the lender can take the property and recoup their loss that way. So there are back to title and escrow there. So escrow is a neutral third party. They, provide a number of services throughout the transaction. And if over time, you will work with, a number of different companies, and you'll find somebody that you like their communication style, their personality, the services that they provide, their flexibility, or whatever is important to you, and you'll kind of gravitate to wanting to use them over and over. Sometimes you can't use the same title and escrow company. For example, CW Title is only in Washington State. They're not a national company, but they're good company. But say you are writing an offer on a property in Ocean Shores. Well, they don't have a title plant in Grace Harbor County. So in that case, if you had a closer at CW Title you like, you would need to use a different title company, Grace Harbor Title. And that's okay too. That works fine. But most of the time, you're going to use the same company for title and escrow. And if you don't have a closer that you want to specify, you can write in the name of the company and they will assign you one. But again, you might be using title and escrow as specified in your listing too, because we're talking about the perspective of you as a buyer's agent writing an offer for your buyer. Okay, line 11, closing date. And how are we going to decide when we're going to close? Well, this is another one of these things that has to be a consultative decision. You need to, first of all, talk to your buyer's lender, if they have a lender, to see when they can close on this. Different types of loans have different processing times. A conventional loan is usually 30 days. FHA can be 40, and VA can be 45. Secondarily, you need to talk to your buyer. When do they want to close? Part of this might be what their current living situation is. Are they renting? Do they want to move over a long weekend? Do they have other scheduling concerns? Maybe they don't want to close until school is out. Something like that. And that also affects your possession date. And typically the buyers are going to take possession on closing. Sometimes you will see in a listing, it's kind of rare now. It used to be kind of standard that possession would be 3 days after closing, but now it's usually same day. If you do have a buyer that wants to occupy a property prior to closing, or a seller who's going to stay in the property after closing, there's a form for that. So it's a rental agreement. And let's look at the corresponding paragraphs to line 11. And that's going to be paragraph F. Let's go down to that, closing and possession. So this is the definition of closing. And remember that the purchase and sale is a form of instruction to escrow. So this is telling escrow what they need to do during the course of the transaction. Closing agent, that's escrow. You're going to close this on the closing date. If it falls on a Saturday, Sunday, or legal holiday, then you, escrow, will close it the next day. That's a business day. That's not a Saturday, Sunday, or legal holiday. And what are the seller's obligations on closing? Well, seller, you've got to deliver keys, garage door remotes, and access codes to buyer on the closing date or possession date, whichever comes first. Buyers entitled to possession at 9 p.m. on the possession date. This is important because a lot of times, and more than once, I get a call from a buyer broker that says, you know, we're closing today and my buyer arranged for a moving truck to be there at 2 p.m. and the sellers aren't out and the buyers are parked outside on the street with, the moving truck and with all their worldly possessions on the back of the truck, and they can't get into the property because the sellers aren't out. What should we do? And I have to remind them that unless they have made prior arrangements in a negotiation with the seller, the buyers aren't entitled to those keys until 9 p.m. Seller has till 9 p.m. Now, usually on the day of closing, once you get recording numbers from the county, and escrow will send those out and say, congratulations, you're closed. Usually at that point, the key exchange takes place. And that's a result of your having a prior conversation with a listing agent to find out when the seller's going to be out, when the buyers are going to be able to get in. But it's not unusual for you to get a key out of a lockbox or meet the listing agent to get the key or stop by the listing agent's office to pick up the key during business hours on closing day, but that has to be prearranged. So, yeah, we've had situations where then, here's our buyer with their moving truck, and then a couple hours go by and the moving company says, okay, we'll give you another 45 minutes, then we've got to go. We'll put your stuff in a storage unit, where do you want it to go? And then, we'll have to come back. And by the way, there'll be an extra charge for unloading and loading and keeping it somewhere overnight, or if it has to stay in the truck overnight, they're going to charge you for that. And this causes a lot of stress unduly to the buyer that can be avoided by making sure you're asking those questions and making these arrangements prior to the closing date to find out when the buyer can get into the property. Otherwise, it's going to be 9 p.m. And if you provide possession to a buyer prior to that time without seller's permission, I get plenty of complaints on that. So, it's better to be proactive and have those conversations with the listing agent before closing. More obligations for the seller include maintaining the property in its present condition until the buyer's provided possession. So anything that breaks has to be either repaired or replaced, including but not limited to plumbing, heat, electrical, and all included items. And anything that doesn't work correctly or at all has to be replaced by a system or appliance of at least equal quality. Buyer has the right to walk through the property within 5 days of closing to make sure that this has all taken place. And seller can't enter into or modify existing leases or rental agreements, service contracts, or any other agreements affecting the property that have terms extending beyond closing without buyer consenting to that. If possession transfers at time other than closing, so if the buyer's going to occupy prior to closing or seller's going to stay in the property for a bit after closing, here they handily tell you what form to use. 65A, rental agreement occupancy prior, or 65B, rental agreement seller occupancy after. And make sure that your client realizes that they need to contact their respective insurance companies. If a seller is going to occupy after closing, obviously they're going to need to cancel their homeowner's insurance and get renter's insurance. And the buyers also need renter's insurance if they're going to occupy prior to closing.
Hey, Susan.
Yeah,
So, I mean, this is like related to like appliances that are a part of the contract. So
Yeah.
I was watching like a video on Instagram where, well, so they were doing a closing for a house, and in the contract, the refrigerator was included, and then prior, like before closing, the sellers took the refrigerator, or I think it was after closing, the sellers took the refrigerator. And that like that's a breach of contract, right?
yes, but if it was taken after closing, it's theft because that's the buyer's property after closing.
Yeah. I'm not sure if it was before the closing or after closing, because I think it was before closing because he says this deal isn't gonna go through.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
an excellent point in question, and that's why it's so critical to do your walkthrough with your buyers and make sure that everything that should be there is there. Um, and I would encourage you, don't wait till the day before or the day of closing to do your walkthrough, because at that point, it's very, the timing is very tight in terms of, do the buyers want to go ahead and close, or do they want to negotiate with and you've got to inform the listing agent something's missing or something's not working, and you
Mhm.
still have time to get a change made on your settlement statement. Say, oh gosh, the stove doesn't work anymore, and here you're 2 days out from closing. And it's gonna be hard for the seller to get that item, get it delivered, get it hooked up all in, 48 hours. So really make it your goal to do your walkthrough 5 days before closing. Because that gives you time to inform the listing agent and
Mhm.
get the seller to, perform their contractual obligation to repair or replace the item that's missing. Now, if you get to, so the buyer's options are to not close if that isn't made right. But if buyers don't want to hold up closing and it's not solved before closing, then it's once they're in ownership, it's really their problem, and they're gonna have to talk directly to the seller. If the seller won't make it right, they have the option to either take them to small claims court or hire an attorney.
Okay.
So better to try and solve it prior to closing and keep everybody out of court.
Mhm.
I could talk quite a bit more about this under the heading how not to buy your client's appliances. Because if more than once a buyer broker has ended up buying a refrigerator because it's missing or it's the wrong one, or they've switched it out, and it's the day before closing and the buyer's goods are already in a moving truck coming from Arkansas. They don't want to wait, but they want that fridge. So um, don't cut yourself short and have to, if you want to retain the buyer's goodwill. Sometimes you have to throw a little money at a problem, but do your walkthrough as early as you can, 5 days prior to closing, and get the seller to make it right. The last part of this paragraph talks about the RCW, which is our Revised Code of Washington, which is the body of laws that govern our state, require at least one smoke detector and also carbon monoxide alarm. And then we have a nice indemnification that says we, the buyer brokers and our firms, are held harmless if there's any claim resulting from the seller's failure to install these items. Now, if there's a lender, the appraiser is always going to look for these items. If you are on a listing appointment, you're going to make a listing active and they don't have these items, suggest they run to Costco and grab those and get them installed, because not only is it going to come up in any appraisal, but it's a safety issue as well, and it's the law. And they're not very expensive at Costco. And you can get the stick-up kind. It doesn't have to be hardwired in. Newer houses do have these items hardwired into their systems often. But that's the end of the discussion on closing and possession. Okay, this seems like a good time to take a break. Why don't we take a break till 3:15? We will see. Any other questions before we break? Okay, awesome. We'll come back and start with line 12. See you then. Back. Welcome back. So let's dive into line 12, services of closing agent for payment of utilities. So, oh, I don't know if I have 22K in there. Hold on one sec. Let me grab that one for you. So who's the closing agent? Well, again, that's going to be escrow. And this just means that escrow is going to get payoffs on the lienable utilities. And I would always say, yes, do this, because it's a routine part of escrow's service. And if you don't have them do it, it just means that you, as a buyer's agent, are going to have to verify that the accounts are kept current. Now, let me just grab 22K so you can look at that. I have too many things on my desktop here. Okay, I'm just gonna move it over so I don't waste time looking for it. Okay, here's 22K, and this is something that's often gonna be attached to a listing because it's something sellers can fill out ahead of time. If it's not in the supplement section, and you can just attach a blank one. Obviously, the first part here that references the purchase and sale that you're writing, the date and the name of the buyer and seller and what property is, are going to be filled in, but all this is going to be blank. So that's okay. You can do that. And then it's the seller's responsibility to complete it and sign it when they review the offer, right? So if you do request escrow to get those utility payoffs, then do attach a 22K, even if it is blank. And the only time that it's waived is maybe you've got a tenant purchasing from a landlord and the utilities are already in their name. Maybe it is a propane tank and a well, and there aren't any lienable utilities. But generally, you're going to always check that box requested and attach that MLS Form 22K. And remember that paragraph H already states in our closing costs that the sellers are going to pay their prorated share of utilities through closing. But I would go ahead and put the responsibility on escrow to make sure that the seller's current, and that's a good thing. So you don't want to take on that responsibility for your buyer. Let escrow do the work. And by the way, on that Form 22K, if you are ever the one filling it out, or your seller's filling it out and they said, oh, I don't know the address for Tacoma Public Utilities or something, you really don't need all that. All you really need is to put in like the name, city, it would be like City of Tacoma or Lakewood Water or whatever it is. That you don't need to put in the email, the website, the address, city, state, zip, fax number, none of that. Pierce County Sewer. That's all you need. Or it might be something like Water District number 4. Or let's see, electricity, whatever that is, it might be Seattle City Light. Or if it's in Gig Harbor, it might be Peninsula Light. Like all of us, escrow works in, multiple counties, and they may not know exactly which water district serves White Center or a property in Moses Lake or, whatever. So it is helpful for them to have the information from you, meaning when you're the listing agent, but they are going to verify this with the seller as well. So that's a good thing. So that's just kind of a routine thing. Always check that box, let escrow do the heavy lifting and attach your 22K. You don't have to memorize which utilities are lienable or not. Escrow will figure that out. And by the way, they know. By the way, some solid waste removal providers, in other words, the garbage companies, some of them are now lienable. So those do need to be included. And again, seller will pay those off from their proceeds at closing, and escrow. Verifies the utilities, requests the payoff, puts that amount on to bring the seller current to the day of closing on the settlement statement, and then they actually cut a check at closing to get that paid off, and they send it off. When you've got a seller and you're coming up to closing, it doesn't hurt to remind them that they need to close their accounts, their utility accounts, as well as cancel their homeowner's insurance. It's a nice point of service to give that reminder. Please make sure that you don't say cancel your service on your utilities, because if they do, then you know what? They're going to turn the power off. They're going to turn the water off if you cancel the service. No, what you want to do is close the account. And on the buyer side, you want to remind your buyer a few days before closing, hey, don't forget to contact, Puget Sound Energy and City of Tacoma to set up your account to ensure continued service. Sometimes you have like Edgewood Water Company, you have to do an application, and it's kind of halfway a co-op, different companies have different requirements, but the big ones are pretty simple. You fill out an application and tell them, when you're when you're closing on the property, and then they will get your account set up. Also, wasn't this, yeah, I think it was the last time I moved, which it's been 6 years now, but the last time I moved, I forgot to cancel the monitoring of my security system. It was one of those automatic bills. It wasn't very much. And I did not realize for like 3 months that I was still paying for the monitoring of my security system, which was, uh, dumb, since I didn't own the property anymore and had sold it to somebody else. But anyway, anything you can think of in the house that needs to be, their cable service. I don't know if they have somebody coming to mow the lawn, or any other automatic billing things. Make sure you again, it's not a requirement, it's not your responsibility as a broker. It's a nice element of the service that you're providing to your client, whether buyer or seller, to just provide that reminder. And I used to send my buyers, like I would just copy and paste the URL for the utilities. Or if they were not, an online person, I would provide the phone number for them to call, to initiate, the opening of their account. And reminding them of the closing date. I would wait until the last few days, maybe 3-4 days out from closing, just because sometimes things move around a little bit at the last minute. And, so you want to make sure you're really locked in for your closing date before you have them start paying for the utilities at the property. Okay, charges, assessments levied before but due after closing are going to be either assumed by the buyer or prepaid in full by seller at closing. So this only pertains to charges that have been levied, so we know how much they are, that this bill's been generated, but it's not due until after the closing date. I would always say, have the seller pay it at closing. Now, this might be typically the most common one I would say is an HOA special assessment, because those are, they get bids on them, they have to vote, have meetings and vote on them, and then they decide when the work is going to take place, and that can easily take some time. So it's typical for an HOA to know they've got a special assessment coming up. They know how much it is per unit, but it's not yet payable. It's payable sometime in the future, might be next month, it might be next year. Depends on when the work is actually going to be done for re-roofing building D or resurfacing the parking lot or whatever it is. So let's look quickly at paragraph H on page 4. And this talks about how to prorate out these the charges, and also this second part of the paragraph here, starting with line 114, says buyers advised to verify the existence and amount of any local improvement district, that's an LID, capacity or impact charges, or any charges assessments that may be charged before or after closing. Seller will pay such charges that are or become due on or before closing. Charges, again, this just reiterates what we went over. Charges levied before closing but due after will be paid however you fill out that line 13. And we want to ask the seller to do it. Other common charges, King County has a sewer capacity charge. And those are typically fairly low monthly amounts, but they go on for a long time. And it's for newer properties. Older properties have paid them off. An LID, you might see something like, there's an alley that runs behind the houses in Old Tacoma for a block. And the city's gonna repave that, but because it's not a public thoroughfare, and only those 5 homes are using that alley, they are gonna charge the homeowners some of the cost for resurfacing the alley. And again, the you know, the wheels of bureaucracy turn slowly, so it takes quite a while for that to go through committee, for them to get bids, to schedule the work, and, you know, then figure out how much each homeowner is gonna have to pay, and is it gonna be a one-time fee, is it gonna be a month, payable monthly? Um, you know, I grew up on Browns Point, and when they converted to sewer from septic, they had a charge, gosh, it was spread out over, I don't know, maybe close to 10 years or something. So the month, so that conversion cost, converting to sewers, it was really, you know, fairly expensive, but they spread it out over such a long time that it was a very small amount per month, you know, like $50 or something. But these things are gonna show up on title. So another reason to make an ally out of your title officer or your escrow closer to help you read that title report. Because if you don't check the box correctly, your buyer might be, you know, in for an extra charge that they haven't planned on. And some of the HOA, when you have an HOA assessment, they're typically not spread out like the utility charges are. They're a much bigger amount for a shorter amount of time. You know, it might be an extra $500 a month for 2 years, something like that. Or it might be a one-time fee, you know, $1,500. We've got to paint all the, you know, this whole section of the townhouses, and everybody has to come up with $1,700 in the month of March. Like anything, it's negotiable. But your primary focus is to keep the buyer's interests first and foremost. So whatever is best for them, that's what you want to choose. So in this case, we're going to ask seller to pay those charges. Okay, line 14. If a seller is not a US citizen for our tax purposes, and they don't pay their capital gains tax at closing, the IRS might go after the buyer and put a lien on the property. So it's very important for every transaction that the FERPTA form is included. Now, this is a disclosure form, so it doesn't need to be listed in your addenda line, but it does need to be included in every transaction. Gosh, don't I have this one either? Okay, let me see if I can grab the FERPTA for you. Oh my word. Okay, easier to find it in the MLS than to try and find it on my desktop, I guess. Let's look at that. Okay. Here's the FERPTA certification. Now, most of the time in your transaction, the seller is going to be a US citizen, and so the buyer doesn't have to fill out the bottom part of the form because that's only applicable if the seller is not a US citizen. And it's just for the seller to stipulate to them being a US citizen or not, and then provide their social, which it's usually given to escrow at closing. You as the buyer's broker don't need to know the seller's social security number and their home address, and then they sign off that what they're telling is true. So I believe last time I checked, a seller, if they are not a US citizen, they have to pay, I think 15% on their gain on the property sale. So it's a substantial amount. Now, this form is due to escrow from the seller within 10 days of mutual acceptance. It is not required to be sent to the buyer's broker, but I'm telling you, you've got to have it in every transaction. If it's typically included in the supplements on a listing, but if it's not there, once you go into mutual, you should tell the escrow closer, and you can do it when you send over your signed around purchase and sale. Hey, we're signed around. Listing agent is, Joe Kennedy, and I'm the buyer's broker. Please reach out to my buyers to facilitate earnest money deposit, which is due on Friday, the 11th of July. And here's their phone and email contact. And by the way, I need the FERPTA for my file. Just ask for it all then. It's escrow's responsibility to pursue that if they don't get it. If that is never supplied, the buyer can actually exit the transaction and get the earnest money back. It's absolutely required for the seller to provide this. Now, there is a buyer certification required for certain circumstances. Oh, here it says right here, 15% of the amount realized from the sale has to be paid to the IRS. And again, just like with any financial encumbrance, the escrow is going to pay that off from seller's proceeds.
So this form is required for every mutual agreement?
Yep,
Okay.
everyone. Oh, this is evidence of funds. That's not the one I wanted. Okay. But most of the time, it's going to be in the supplements, and they're going to have checked that they are not a non-resident alien. That means I am a US citizen. And you can check it off your list. But just be aware that it is a requirement. And when you're uploading your documents to your command file, it's going to be a required item. So that will help you remember. Because all documents need to be uploaded to your file, your command opportunity, within 2 days of execution. That means signed around by the clients, not just buyers sign only and they're waiting for the sellers to agree. Once it's all mutually agreed upon, any of the documents. It's due within 2 days. And as you're uploading those things, you'll be able to see which ones are required and which ones are optional for the type of transaction, like residential or manufactured home or rental or whatever it is. It's keyed to have the documents noted as either required or optional. Things like a 22J, that's a lead-based paint disclosure. It's required if the property was built prior to 1978, but if it was built 1978 or later, it's not required, so it's optional. We'll go over that next time. We'll go over all those addenda next time. Okay, so FERPTA, usually you're going to see is and you'll be able to get that information if the FERPTA is in your supplements in the listing, which you always want to look at before you write the offer. Okay, line 15. Information verification period. Okay, this is a real handy little bonus contingency for your buyer. So let's look at the corresponding paragraph for that. It's W. Here we go. Paragraph W. Unless satisfied or waived, buyer shall have the time period set forth in this term to verify all information provided from the seller or the listing brokerage firm related to the property. That means what's in the listing, what's on the sign, what's in the flyer, anything that the listing broker said or the seller said. And it has to be I would say, to exercise a contingency, it has to be something, significant. Maybe it said that there was 3,000 square feet and there's only 2,600. Well, that's a pretty big difference in percentage terms. Now, if you've got a 6,000 square foot house and it's different by 600 square feet, that's not as big a difference. But if there's materially inaccurate information, say that it said in the listing that the property had a sewer, was hooked up to sewer, and it turns out it's not hooked up to sewer, it's septic, and your buyer doesn't want septic. Well, this gives you a contingency. You can get out and get your earnest money back if there's something that's significantly different between what the seller or listing agent said or represented and what is actually true in the property. Now, I used to see the default on this is 10 days. But you get to choose how many days you want it to last. And I'm typically seeing just like 2 or 3 days. But I would give yourself, I really like 5 better. And even, you might even want to have it match your inspection contingency. Maybe they say that, the siding is hardy plank and it turns out it's not hardy plank, it's wood. Or some other difference like that, that your seller isn't, or your buyer doesn't want. That's a material difference and that would give them an out. Okay, but so would your inspection contingency. So your use of this is probably going to be colored by whether or not you're going to have an inspection contingency as well. You can also, like with any contract, if you're trying to strengthen your offer, you can waive it, especially if you've got an inspection contingency, which is a strong subjective contingency for your buyer. Okay, agency disclosure. Here you're going, this is a legally required disclosure to say who represents the buyer, who represents the seller, if they're unrepresented, or if you are a limited dual agent representing both. Okay, here's the most important line. This is how we get paid. This first section, 17A, where it says seller's offer, if any, this is how much the seller has offered to pay the buyer brokerage in the listing itself. Now, this should auto-populate for you if you're in Transaction Desk and creating your transaction that way. 17B, amount to be paid by seller. This is how much you've agreed to work for. It could be more, it could be less, it could be the same. You as the buyer broker have the opportunity to negotiate with the seller for your compensation from them right on the first page of the purchase and sale. Now, what if the seller offers 3.5% and you've agreed to work for 3% on your buyer brokerage service agreement? What happens to that extra 0.5%? Well, there are a few options, and there's a form that we need to attach to specify which of those options are going to happen. So you would attach, if it's different, if you're going to work for less than what the seller's paying, you attach 41C and say the difference between what the seller's offering and the amount that is going to be paid by the seller is going to be credited to the buyer. That's the first option, credit to buyer. And then if the buyer's getting a loan, remember that their ability to use this credit is subject to the lender's approval. Different loan types have different requirements. They might be required to put a certain amount down to qualify for their loan. They might not be able to use the credit. It's always good to ask the buyer's lender. But if there's an amount not approved by the buyer's lender, you can, as the buyer broker, say, we want the purchase price reduced by that amount, or finally credited to the seller, which is the last choice and should always be your last choice. Try to, if say, this happened recently where we had I had a buyer broker ask me about this, say the seller's offering more than I agreed to work for. Now what do I do? And I said, well, have you talked it over with your buyer? And they said, yes, and I've been working with them for 6 months. We've had a couple other offers that you've written a couple, maybe 3 other offers that we didn't get. And he said, you've worked so hard for this. I think you should have the extra money. So I said, great, I love your buyer. But now you have to amend your buyer brokerage service agreement because you can only get paid as much as is specified in that buyer brokerage service agreement. So back to our example, the seller's offering 3.5 and you've agreed to work for 3. So if you're not going to give the buyer a credit, or if the buyer can't use the credit, have it applied to the sales price, and the buyer has agreed that you will get paid that additional amount, that extra 0.5%, then you need to amend your buyer brokerage service agreement, which is Form 41, with a 41A, saying that your compensation will be 3.5% and have your buyer sign it. And do that before you submit the offer. It's better that way, believe me, for compliance reasons. Okay, any questions about line 17? If you don't fill this out at all, or if you only if only A is filled in and you never write in the amount that the seller is to pay you, the seller has no legal obligation to pay you. And that has gone through the court system, and buyer broker lost. They went through a whole transaction and did not get paid. And I think it was in Bellevue when it was $1 million property, so must have really hurt. So it's important to pay attention to these terms, but especially this one, because I want all of you to make as much as you possibly can. And certainly, I don't think any of us can afford to work for free. So I don't want you working for free. Okay, we're closing in on it. Line 18, addenda. This is simply where you write in the form numbers of all the addenda that are attached and part of the offer. It's only, index for the addenda, so be sure and write them in so that you don't have any legal problems later. And next we have a place for the buyer to sign along with their personal information and your contact information. It's going to auto-populate with the not the seller signature, but their, whatever's in the listing is going to populate here. And I occasionally get questions about what's the firm's document email address. It's on the MLS, but if you're in Federal Way, it's kwfwbroker@gmail. And if you're in Mountains to Sound, kwmtsbroker@gmail.com. So very simple, but it's right in the MLS. So you can always find it there, along with your own contact information. Now, is a contract valid if you don't have the buyer's address, city, state, zip, phone number, email? Sure, the buyer doesn't have to have their personal information on that page. But again, and I know I'm repeating myself, but because I've worked in escrow for over a decade, I'm emphasizing that if your buyer doesn't care to have those details on the front page of the purchase and sale, give them to escrow so they can get a hold of them. And let them know if they're a day sleeper, if they're going to be gone to Hawaii the week before closing, or right now, or give them some help them help you. and make sure they know how to reach your client, buyer or seller, even if that's not represented on this first page of the purchase and sale. Okay, well, we made it through the purchase and sale. Remember that also, if your buyer or seller is married, and I get this question, I would say, oh, probably almost every week. My seller's married. Do both and they're selling the house. Do both the sellers have to sign on the purchase and sale? Yes, they do. Same with the buyers, if they're married. Now, you can have two buyers and two sellers that are not married. It could be a brother and sister that inherited a property and are now selling, or you could have two friends or two cousins or two significant others that are, purchasing together. That's fine. But if one easy way to remember it on the sellers is they vest out the same way they vested in, and that means on the vesting deed, which is that deed that transferred the ownership to these people, if it has both of them, if it has whatever people it has on that deed, that's who has to sign off on it when they sell it. And for the buyer, it's how do they want to be vested? How are they taking title to the property? Are they taking title, together? And if so, then they both need to sign. Whoever's going to be on title has to sign. And just as we discussed in the first class, we're needing to use their complete legal names, and the way they sign should match how you've listed their complete legal name up here. You don't have to specify down here marital status. That goes up here. Okay. What other questions do you have for me?
I have a question about line 17.
Okay.
Let's see. So you said you might need to do the Form 41C and you submit it before you submit the offer. Does that mean before you have an offer and you've written it up, or does that mean before you enter it into the system?
I would like it to be dated before the purchase and sale,
Gotcha. Okay.
or at least on the same day. So
Okay.
that it would not look good for an audit situation if you say, oh, I want the seller to pay me 3.5%, and then your buyer brokerage service agreement says 3%, and then you don't amend that for a few days or a week or a month, or not until closing or something.
Yeah.
Because legally you can, it's a Washington state law now that you can only get paid as much as you have specified in your buyer brokerage service agreement. So you got to make those match.
Okay.
Better sooner than later.
Yep.
The time that would be critical is, in an audit, but we do get audited. I have had, okay, in the last, let's see, I've been here almost 3 years, and in 3 years, we've had all 5 of our licenses audited. So, Federal Way has Burien as a branch, and Kent has Enumclaw as a branch, and now we also have Lake Washington South, which is Rosie O'Rourke's team, and they're going to be splitting off on their own as their own separate franchise, but right now they're still a branch. And then we've taken over offices in Wenatchee and Chelan, and then we also have a referral only network. So whenever you have changes, so the licenses that have been audited are Kent was 3 years ago, and then I came a few months after that, and Federal Way, Burien, Enumclaw, and the referral only network have all been audited. So, and that's just in the last 3 years. So they are checking up on us. The Department of Licensing is auditing actively and aggressively, especially in light of the new the new laws that we have to follow, and this is one of them. And
Mhm.
again, it's that underlying philosophy of transparency and disclosure to consumers, that's so important, in our industry.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
Oh, yeah. We don't have to keep looking at the screen. Well, you guys have been a great class attendees, and I hope you got some good info out of the class. And thank you so much for being here, and I hope to see you next time.
Yeah, thank you so much, Susan.
Thanks, Kelly.
Appreciate you. Okay.
You too. Take care.
You too. Bye-bye.